Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
I think over the past week, every conversation Jill and I have had has been some sort of competition about who's dealing with the most heat. It's been 112 degrees Fahrenheit here in Gilbert with about 16% humidity. Meanwhile, Jill has been suffering through 85 degrees Fahrenheit and 70% humidity. The bottom line is that we're both feeling the heat, and the horses are too. My horse has been dripping in sweat from just 45 minutes of walking exercise, and Jill's horse is dripping in sweat coming in from the paddock. If you've listened to the podcast for a while, you'll know that probably my favorite thing to talk about is ration balances, and a close second would be salt. I'm a believer in supplementing salt all year long, but certainly in hot weather. But what kind of salt and how much? And what about electrolytes? Should you do those too? We decided it's time to revisit salt and electrolytes and try to answer all your questions.
We put up a post on our social media channels announcing that we would be recording this episode and asking whether anyone had questions, and we were inundated, which is awesome. We love when you guys send us questions that we can answer. And there were so many questions about salt and electrolytes. Claire, let's start with why you are so into salt. Why should we be providing our horses with salt?
Yeah, and I just feel like before I get to that, I think sending us questions we can answer. Yeah, don't send us questions we can't answer.
That's true.
Although actually, sometimes I love a good question that I don't know the answer to because I always love learning things. So actually send us the questions I don't know the answer to and I will endeavor to find the answers. But anyway, yes, why do I love salt so much? And why should we be providing it to our horses? The amount of sodium in the horse's diet can really be quite variable, at least what's provided by the diet, right? So I've seen hay analysis that'll provide enough sodium to meet a horse's daily maintenance requirement, but I've also seen plenty of analyses that come nowhere close. So if you're not testing your hay, as we've said many times before, you really don't know what's in it, and it could be providing ample sodium or it could be way low in sodium. So given how important that sodium is for maintaining a thirst reflex and the horse's desire to drink, as well as for the functioning of the musculoskeletal system, I think it's really important that owners ensure that they're giving their horses additional sources of salt beyond what may be naturally occurring in their forage and other feeds. So, and honestly, I think providing your horse with adequate salt is probably the cheapest form of colic insurance you can buy.
I know that you always recommend giving loose salt in feed. Why don't you recommend salt blocks?
Oh, it's not that I don't like salt blocks. I do like salt blocks, and I do recommend salt blocks. Like every horse should have access to salt all the time. And the easiest way to do that, right, is in a block. But it's a rare individual who eats a block, adequate amounts of salt off of a block. And there are, the occasional horses that just inhale a salt block. I've definitely had clients who put out a salt block and the thing's gone in 2 days, which is not great. Those horses don't get a salt block. But, most horses are not going to do that. And in fact, most just really don't consume a block at all. And they're just not going to meet their daily sodium needs that way. And so blocks were really not designed with horses in mind. I don't know. Have you been licked by a cow? I'm sure you've been licked by a cow.
Of course I've been licked by a cow.
And how is it different than being licked by a horse?
Well, their tongues are like sandpaper. They're really, really rough.
I know. I love cows, and I love cows, and I love I love they always stick their tongues up their noses, which I think is so cute. Anyway, going off on a tangent there, but yes, you're exactly right. Right, cow tongues are rough, and so they do a great job of degrading a salt block. A horse's tongue is really soft and smooth, and it's just not going to scrape that much salt off of a block. And I don't know, this is being very anthropomorphic, but for me, the thought of licking a salt block is disgusting. I'm not that into salt personally. But that's being anthropomorphic. But yeah, so, horses don't very effectively degrade a salt block. And a lot of owners tell me that their horses do lick their blocks. But to consume their daily sodium requirement from a block, like a typical sort of, 1,000-pound, 500-kilo horse, would have to be going through about a 2-pound block of salt a month. And when I say that, a lot of owners are like, oh, like, it's not doing that, right?
So the last time I bought a salt block
was
maybe like September. We're recording this in July.
Right.
I mean, to go through, I might buy one a year, a 2-pound one. And you're saying they need to eat one of those in 30 days.
Right.
Not happening.
Yeah. And I think the small blocks actually weigh maybe 4 pounds. So maybe that would, you have to account for the size of the block. But yeah, I mean, the reality is that most of our blocks stay out, in the stalls or out in fields for months. Never change. And often the only thing that makes them change is, we had one we hung on the fence in the field and the rain just dissolved it, right? So, I mean, it wasn't the horses that made it disappear. But yeah, so it's because adequate salt is so important to keeping horses drinking. Like, I just like to give them their daily requirement loose in their feed, and then absolutely have a block available as well. Like, I don't know if this is a fun fact, but like sodium is actually the only mineral that we know that horses actually have a craving for, that they will actually go and seek out. It's one reason why horses, like, they'll like lick your hand, or like weird things like railings, or like I used to find that they would, if you had your winter blanket, say, like over the hitching rail in front of the horse while it's tied up and it was like inside out, they would lick the lining of their blankets, right? Like if they had gotten a little sweaty in their blanket and there was like sweat on the inside of the blanket, they would lick it. Like, they're looking for salt, right? So oftentimes, they are drawn to salt. So I like to give their minimum amount loose in their feed, then give them a block. And if they want more, they may go find it. At least they've got the option of having more if they want.
So before we start talking about loose salt, let's cover the blocks. What kind of blocks do you recommend and why?
My favorite also happens to be the cheapest, which is always good, right? That's a plain white block. I don't recommend the red trace mineral blocks, because the concentrations of minerals in those is not enough to make any meaningful contribution to their daily requirement of those minerals. So, if you're relying on your trace mineral salt block to really give your horse any meaningful amount of copper, for example, like, it's just not going to happen. Like, there's just not, they just don't lick the block that much. And even if they did lick the block and get their daily requirement from the block of sodium, they're just not going to it's not going to be anywhere close to their requirement of copper. So it's sort of pointless. And so then you're just spending money for those extra ingredients that don't make any meaningful contribution to your horse's diet anyway. So you're not benefiting from that extra investment. So additionally, those red blocks that you see, all sort of browny red blocks, they're that color because of the iron that's in them. And horses get plenty of iron from their forage and really don't need additional sources of iron. And before somebody says, but my horse is anemic, anemia in horses is very rarely due to iron deficiency. It's normally secondary to something else. And when you get that something else figured out, the anemia takes care of itself. There's just so much iron in our forages, like, you easily meet the horse's iron requirement just from the forage that they're eating.
What about the Himalayan salt on a rope or the other natural salt blocks?
Those are fine, right? I mean, you're going to pay more for them, right? You're going to pay more for the privilege of a hole on a rope. But I do hear owners tell me that their horses use those more than the white blocks, which is great. So, I mean, if your horse prefers the taste of Himalayan salt, awesome. I mean, I have one hung for my horse, gets it off the floor. So I definitely have one of those. So if you're happy spending the extra money, go for it. But no, it doesn't really have any additional nutritional benefit. Also keep in mind when you hang them, so that they actually have to be able to lick them. So I came to the barn one day and my daughter's pony had a block. We were in a mare motel situation, which is a pretty common type of stall here in Arizona because we like a lot of airflow. So it's literally like pipe panels. And I had hung the salt block from the pipe panel and he was like licking it. And every time he licked it, the thing swung away from him, which, you know, was kind of fun, right? I mean, the other thing is it's enrichment, right? It's like something to do, like mess with this thing, fiddle with it, it moves around. But it's not so great if they're actually trying to lick it to get salt off of it. Every time they lick it, the damn thing swings away from them. So if you want to hang one for the fun of it, for them to play with, great. But if you're hanging it, you know, make sure you've also got another one that's hung in a way that there's something behind it that it won't swing away as they interact with it, so they can actually like push against it and lick it and actually get some salt off of it. So, the other thing you have to think about, you know, is where you put your blocks beyond just hanging them. Like if you have a block, you know these massive blocks, like the 40, 50 pound blocks, like I've had those before. And, you know, you can buy like a square plastic tub that you sit them in. They make them for those blocks. And often when I go into stalls, they're in the corner of the stall covered in shavings and dirt. And so I'll say to a client, you know, do you give your horse a salt block? Oh yeah, like it's in the stall. And you look in the stall and there's this very sad looking block covered in shavings, dust and cobwebs. And it's not really surprising that a horse isn't using that, right? And then also when you travel, if you're relying solely on a block, you need to take that with you. Right. And I think a lot of people don't think about that. And so again, that's a reason why I like to put loose salt in feed, is that if you forget to take your block with you, the horse is still getting salt in their feed every day while you're traveling. I've definitely had people, again, where I've done consultations with people at shows, and I'll say, what do you do for your salt? And they say, oh, he has a block. And I look over the door in the stall at the show and I'm like, well, there's no block here. And the owner says, well, I didn't bring it with me. And they've been at the show for 5 days.
Right.
You know, it's really hot out. And actually, the one client I'm thinking of, part of her horse's struggle, she was a dressage rider, and part of her complaint was that the horse was struggling with his tempi changes by the end of the show. She didn't have enough horse to like get through the line of tempi changes. And I'm thinking, well, sodium is necessary for muscle contraction and neuromuscular function. And we all know what it's like when you're dehydrated, right? You get a little like foggy in your head and you're not really thinking great. So I'm like, is this horse just like electrolyte depleted by like the, you know, end of the show? So she puts her leg on to us for something that has to happen now, right? You only have, like, if you're doing like whatever your timing is on your tempis, at most you've got 4 strides. Like it has to happen pretty quickly. And if your brain's a bit because you have, you know, you're feeling dehydrated, that horse can't respond as quickly.
And also
as you
your
want.
muscles feel weak.
Yes.
When you're dehydrated. I mean,
exactly.
And doing tempis is hard.
Exactly. So, I mean, I literally thought part of her problem could be as simple as the fact that the horse was electrolyte depleted by the end of the show because she wasn't taking her block with her. Anyway.
Here's something that you don't have to deal with with salt blocks. So I have run-in sheds.
Yep.
Good place to put the salt block.
Yep.
Have the big, you know, the rubber tub, set it on the ground, put the salt blocks in it. Notice the salt blocks were moving.
Moving?
Yeah. The tub would be there. The blocks would be not in the tub anymore. And I'm like, oh, the horse didn't pick this up. Maybe they pawed it. Maybe they, you know, kicked it, moved it out.
Like the big blocks, like I was just talking about. The big, like 50 pound. Okay, yeah. Okay.
The raccoons. I don't think they were eating them. I mean, I did see a couple little nibbles, but I mean, they're just moving them. They're trying to steal them. They steal all kinds of things, thinking they wanted the salt block.
You must have thought you were going crazy.
The raccoons, they are going to be my demise. But I just... Anyway, so that's something to think about too. You might have other critters sharing your salt blocks if they're sitting out on the ground. And
I know that deer really like salt as well. You have lots of deer. You're always sending me deer pictures, but I don't suspect your deer are going to go in your running sheds. But yeah, I mean, definitely wildlife sometimes appreciate access to salt as well. So
right. So if it starts to move, you might have critters.
Not
I think
ghosts.
I think it's also important to comment about grazing muzzles because lots of people use grazing muzzles now. I use grazing muzzles, but if your horse has a muzzle on, they cannot easily access salt blocks. And I think that this can be overlooked.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, I mean, it's not something that I really think about because I don't really have, muzzled horses the way you do. Right. Yeah, I mean, if your horse is in turnout for long periods of time, like they need a salt source in their turnout, right? Not just in their stall. It doesn't, if your horse is only in the stall for an hour to eat their grain, having their block in their stall is not super helpful, right? They need to actually have a block out, and putting it in a run-in shed if you have one is a great idea because then obviously they aren't just being destroyed by the rain and stuff. But if you're turning out in muzzles, obviously, they're not going to be able to lick the block. Like the muzzles work because the grass comes through the muzzle to them, right? They're not sticking their tongue out of the muzzle. And it seems obvious, right? But it's the kind of detail, to your point, that's like really easy to overlook. Mm-hmm. So in that case, if you have horses turn out for long periods of time in muzzles, then the salt needs to be provided in loose form in some sort of bucket or feeder. And there needs to be enough salt in the pan that when they push the muzzle into it, the salt is deep enough that it will come up through the depth of the muzzle. Right? I mean, like just having a smattering of salt in the bottom of the pan isn't going to help them either.
And the pan needs to be big enough that the muzzle can go in.
Also a fair point. Yeah, I mean, honestly, just like those round rubber feed pans would work. But again, you got to think about where you put it because we all know they like to put their feet in those and tip them over. So, I mean, there are ones you could hang on a fence. You could potentially even screw them onto the fence. They have like things that hang over the back of them onto the fence rail. If you've got wooden plank fencing, you could potentially, or zip tie it or something. Anyway, yeah. Absolutely think about that if you've got muzzled horses.
So we need to be giving our horses salts in their feed and they need to have access to a plain block. How much salt should we be giving them in their feed each day? We received a lot of questions about this, so can you clear that up?
Yeah, I have a really simple kind of rule of thumb for meeting the horse's maintenance daily sodium requirement. And maintenance means the amount of sodium they need if they're just kind of mooching about, not doing anything particular, just ambling around a field, standing in a stall, not working hard. It's a cool day. They're not obviously sweating, right? That's kind of maintenance. So that requirement is 1 tablespoon per 500 pounds of body weight, which for those that work in metric is like just over 225 kilos. So if you're a typical, 1,000, 1,100 pound horse, regular sized Arabian, large pony, small thoroughbred type horse, you're looking at 2 tablespoons a day. And, I would definitely, I like my daughter's pony. I know when you had your pony, like they're around 900 pound body weight. I'm going to round up. I'm going to do the 2 tablespoons a day and not worry about the fact that I may be giving a little bit too much. If you have a big warm blood, a lot of people underestimate the sizes of how much their warm bloods weigh. I mean, it's not unreasonable for a large warm blood, 17-2 well-built warm blood to weigh 1,400 pounds. They're going to get 3 tablespoons a day.
Yeah, or a draft horse. I mean, there's lots of people that have...
Yeah, easily. They might get 4, right? You've got 2,000 pound Percheron. They're going to get 4 a day. So it's really easy. Again, I think we get lulled into, we're always talking about this typical, in inverted commas, horse, right? This 1,100 pound horse. And it's easy to just think, oh, well, I have a horse, he's 11, I'll just give him 2 tablespoons. It's like, no, like... That's a solid, 17-2 hand warm blood.
And that's also just at maintenance. If you have a 1,400 pound warm blood that you're doing 5 days a week, dressage on, eventing, whatever, jumping, that number is going to be adjusted, correct?
We're going to get to that in a minute.
Okay, good. I'll keep my mouth shut. Jumping ahead. Stop jumping ahead. So there's many, many kinds of salt available now. It used to just be plain table salt, nothing exciting. Now we've got light salt, table salt, iodinized salt, mineral salt, kosher salt, Himalayan salt, Redmond salt, Celtic salt, so much salt. I'm sure there are many more. And somebody actually asked us a question about Epsom salt, so that's another one. Does it matter what kind we use? Is salt just salt?
For the most part, it doesn't really matter, but there are a few exceptions and things to be aware of. So Honestly, I don't spend that much time thinking about different types of salt. I typically just use table salt, but you're right. Like people really do get excited about different kinds of salt and want to know about different kinds of salt. So I did a little bit of digging on different kinds of salt. And there are actually some interesting things. This one I knew, right? So light salt is actually, has less, it's about half the sodium chloride. So when we're talking salt, when I'm talking salt for horses, I'm talking sodium chloride, right? Yeah. That is salt, right? And so that's what is, when you think plain table salt, that's what that is. It's sodium chloride. It's about 60% chloride and about 40% sodium. Okay, and then you have the iodized version, which is about the same, and then they've added some often it's potassium iodide to it. It's not very much iodine, but it is. I actually find it useful. It's not uncommon that when I'm looking at people's diets, that they come up just a little short in iodine, and you're going to be giving them the salt anyway. It's a super easy way to just get their iodine up a little bit. Iodine's really important for metabolic function, right? It's important for thyroid function. And so I do think that, personal preference is to use iodized table salt. Because I do think you get the benefit of that. Now, I know somebody asked a question about kelp supplements. Mm-hmm. And those tend to be very high in iodine. And so that is the only time I don't use iodized table salt, is if somebody's using a kelp-based supplement. Like there are some hoof supplements out there, that are kelp-based. It doesn't matter if lots of things have a little bit of kelp in, that's fine. But there are some supplements out there that like are predominantly kelp, and they are very high in iodine, like already multiples of the daily requirement of iodine. I'm not going to use iodized salt in that way because we're already well over the horse's daily intake requirement. Then I'll just use plain table salt. But otherwise, totally fine with iodized table salt. I actually think it's quite useful. Light salt, getting back to light salt, I went off on a tangent there, but like light salt came about because we were worried, right, in the human nutrition realm, people consuming sodium and it being linked to blood pressure and, cardiovascular health. And so light salt was born out of trying to lower people's sodium intakes. And so they've actually reduced it's about half the sodium chloride, and they've replaced that with potassium chloride. It's not therefore going to do such a good job at meeting your horse's sodium requirement, which is really the purpose of the salt. And so I don't do light salt. Then we get into all of the kosher, Himalayan, like Celtic, all these kinds of things. And honestly, they're all about the same. Like they're all 37 to like 39, 40% sodium, 58 to 60% chloride. They're all very much the same. The difference is that you're getting, trace and negligible amounts of trace minerals. Like these are all salts that are either mined directly out of the ground and are kind of in their natural state, or they result from, evaporation. I remember years ago as a kid going to Spain on vacation and seeing these huge salt flats on the coast where they would have these evaporative pools, and they'd take the seawater and evaporate out the water and be left with sea salt, right? And so whatever was naturally occurring in that salt is then there. But it's such a negligible amount. It's making no meaningful contribution. And one of the things, but it does change the taste. So this is why they're a big deal in like cuisine, human cuisine, right? Is that like you have your Himalayan salt, you have your Celtic salt, and they taste different.
So can we say, though, that because, this is just marketing in the horse world, right? Because
it's taking something that's big in human nutrition and then saying, that it's applying it to horse, but like the nutritional value of these salts is really no different.
But what I see the marketing saying is that it's got these other minerals and it's, all these things. You're saying from the research, not you, the research says that there's not enough in any of these specialty salts or fancy salts that make any difference to your horse. Except for the taste. They might taste a little bit better.
Exactly.
But
And
the minerals are doing nothing.
The minerals. Yeah. I mean, think about, yeah, they often tout, 60 additional trace minerals, in small quantities or whatever. I mean, think about it. Like, you're giving 2 tablespoons. How is this? It's not
to your 1,400-pound horse.
Yeah, it's not going to make a meaningful contribution, right? So it just, and again, it's the amount. It's all sodium chloride. So we've like, for example, like take Himalayan salt. If that's 37% sodium and 57% chloride, there's really not that much left for anything else, right? It's just, you're not getting that much. And here's something else to think about: is often those particle sizes of those salts are larger, right? There's a coarser grind. Think your table salt's a very, very fine grind, right? Very small particles. When you get these natural, in inverted commas, salts, they tend to be a coarser grind. And so if you put that in a tablespoon, imagine you've got this tablespoon full of table salt, fine ground table salt, and you have another tablespoon with coarse ground table salt. There's more air between the particle sizes in the coarse ground table salt than there is in the fine ground table salt, which means that my 2 tablespoon recommendation is actually to get you to a specific weight. Like, I know that 2 tablespoons of table salt is right around 1 ounce, right? If you use a coarse salt, that may not weigh 1 ounce. It may be less because of all the air that's trapped between those coarser particle sizes. So that's something to keep in mind. That you're actually giving less salt, less sodium when you're using a coarser ground salt.
Yeah. And what about Epsom salt? Because that was specifically asked.
Oh, yeah, totally different. That's a magnesium, that's not even sodium chloride.
No salt.
And
just in the name.
It's not salt. Yeah, it is. Okay, well, salt. Salt's there's a scientific definition of salt, right? And what a salt is. You can have salts that are not sodium chloride.
Okay.
But when we are thinking salt from a cuisine standpoint, and in this case, a nutrition standpoint, we're talking about sodium chloride. So yeah, not all salt is salt the way we think about it, right? So it's like chemically, right, it's salt. The word salt gets used in both Epsom salts and, say, like table salt because they both form crystals and dissolve in water, right? But the similarity stops there because table salt is sodium chloride and Epsom salts is magnesium sulfate. It doesn't even have chloride in it, right? So it's completely different. And it is a laxative, right? So magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts have a laxative function, which is why we used to put it in bran mashes back in the day, right? To help move things along and stop impaction colics on a horse's day off or whatever. But yeah, there's really, I don't know, I guess it's good for having around makes a great poultice. Good drawing agent, but it doesn't belong in your horse's feed, and it's certainly not going to help them with their daily sodium requirements. It doesn't have any sodium in it.
What about electrolytes? What are they and how do they differ from salt?
So I think it's important to understand, so we just talked about, salts being crystals that dissolve in water, and, electrolytes are a mineral that carries an electric charge when dissolved in body fluids. So think they're dissolved in like blood and sweat, right? So these are minerals that are dissolved in blood and sweat, and they have an electric charge, which means that they can conduct electricity. So that's really important, fact, right? So that charge is what allows electrolytes to do their job. So what their major jobs are to regulate fluid balance, right? To help fluid move in and out of cells. So they're going to help that fluid move in and out of cells, keep things hydrated, keep fluid going where it's supposed to be going. They're going to help with transmitting nerve signals. Nerves are, they're sending electricity. right? So you need something that's going to help conduct that electricity. That's what electrolytes help do. That's part of why they're so important for musculoskeletal function. And they're also, as part of that, they can trigger muscle contractions, including your heart, right? Which is one of the reasons why when you get severely electrolyte depleted, you start going into weird heart rhythms and things, right? So that's why it's so, looking at your electrolyte status. I remember when my dad was very ill, one of the things they picked up on was that his, potassium was really wonky, and they had really big concerns about that, what effect that would have. And that's why, because it's an electrolyte and it's important for all of these body functions, right? So it's one of the reasons why we monitor electrolytes on blood panels and things like that. So the main electrolytes in mammals, including horses, are sodium and chloride, which we've talked about before. So sodium is primarily important for fluid balance, maintaining blood volume, drives thirst, right? We all know that. If you eat salty chips, you want to drink something about 15 minutes later, right? That's why, one of the reasons why it's so important to keep our horses' sodium levels up, because it helps them know they should go drink something. Chloride is an electrolyte, right? So it works alongside sodium to help with fluid balance. Potassium is really important for muscle contraction, nerve function. Calcium is an electrolyte, important for muscle contraction, nerve signaling. And magnesium is another one, right? Magnesium is also important for muscle and nerve function, and all these things do lots of other things too, but these are the kind of main things. So that's what electrolytes are. And so, they have this ability to conduct electricity and dissolve in body fluids.
So if most salt is sodium chloride, then salt is an electrolyte.
Yep, exactly.
Why would someone need to give an electrolyte then if they're giving salt, or do they not need electrolytes when giving salt? I can see how this might get confusing for people.
I was just on a Arizona horse-related forum just this morning, and there was this exact question, right, was being asked. So feeding a balanced diet with added salt is going to provide your horse with the needed levels of the sodium and chloride electrolytes that they need on a cool day, not working, right? We talked about that earlier, under those maintenance conditions. But the problem is that, if the weather gets hotter, they start working and they start sweating, they're going to lose electrolytes in their sweat. And horse sweat's pretty unique because it's very high in electrolytes. It's different than our sweat, right? And it's especially high in chloride. So when horses sweat, whether that's just standing around because the weather's hot and they're sweating, or they're sweating because they're working, they can lose, approximately 10 grams of electrolytes in a liter of sweat. And in those kind of, cool conditions, if you're working them under cool conditions where it's, it's not excessively hot, it's not particularly humid, that 1,100 pound, 500 kilogram horse could lose as much as 5 to 7 liters of sweat, right, in that time. And that's about 1 to 2 gallons. That's a lot, right? And if that sweat is containing 10 grams of electrolytes per liter and they're losing that 5 to 7 liters, then you're looking at 50 to 70 grams of electrolyte in, an hour of steady work, right? So if you're just out in regular cool weather, trotting and cantering for about an hour, your horse can easily be losing 50 to 70 grams of electrolytes. Now I'll turn the thermostat up, right? So now it's hot out where I am, it's humid where you are and hot. And that sweat production could now be 10 to 12 liters in that ride. And so that's, what's that, 2.5 to 3.5 gallons per hour. And suddenly you're realizing there's even more electrolyte, right? So it's a huge amount of electrolyte that they're losing. And it's different than us because our sweat contains relatively low levels of electrolytes. And, just to put this in perspective for people, this is I'm looking at a table that I've had for years, and I wish I could remember exactly where it came from, but I think it might have actually been in a horse magazine a long time ago, and I refer back to it frequently. A horse that's at rest again, needs those 10 grams of sodium, and a day, which you're going to get from your 2 tablespoons of salt. Now let's look at, let's say you're on this one always blows my mind, a 10-hour trailer ride, which living out here on the West Coast is not uncommon, especially my eventing clients are traveling for 10 hours in a trailer. In fact, we're recording this in the lead up to the big event in Montana, Rebecca Farms. And I've been seeing everybody on my social media channels sharing their pictures of trailers, going from California to Montana. That's a long trailer ride, right? I think we can all agree it's a long trailer ride. It's going to take more than 10 hours.
Yeah, for sure.
And this research showed that, and this is actually work done published by Dr. David Marlin. And on that 10-hour trailer ride, they lost 18 hours of sweat, 18 liters of sweat on that 10-hour ride, 50 grams of sodium, 25 grams of potassium, and 95 grams of chloride. And I just don't think we think about our horses sweating in the trailer because the air movement over them, they come out dry.
Right.
Right. You don't see that. But now just think, so you put your horse in the trailer, you travel 10 hours to go to the show. They've already sweat a ton. In the case of the event horses, they maybe have a day before they start competing. Then they do the dressage. Then they run cross country. Then they do show jumping. And I mean, they've lost electrolyte before they even start being ridden. Right. And then if you're not doing a good job of replacing those electrolytes throughout the weekend, and let's say it's a long format 3-day and they're show jumping on the last day, and you want to leave those poles up, right? And the horse is tired, physically tired and dehydrated. And we talked about how we feel when we're dehydrated, so the brain fog and the inability to react quickly. And we start wondering why we start tipping poles, right? And dropping rails in the show jumping, right? So it's a lot. We don't sweat. We don't have that. Our sweat is not that concentrated. So horse sweat is what we call hypertonic with respect to plasma, which means that the sodium concentration in sweat is similar to plasma, right? This is actually a key physiological difference than human sweat, which is hypotonic relative to plasma. And what it means is that that's, as I've been saying, that the concentration of electrolyte in horse sweat is greater than it is in plasma. Right? And that's part of why horses are so prone to significant electrolyte depletion during heavy sweating. Right? It's not just the water they're losing in the sweat, it's all of the electrolytes they lose at the same time. And I think, I don't have any scientific fact for this, but I think we've all heard the saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I think part of that is that you've been out all day trail riding, the horse has been sweating, his sodium levels have dropped. His circulating sodium in his sweat is no longer as high as it was, so he doesn't have the thirst reflex that he would have had if his sodium levels were higher. So you're standing in the river saying, hey, have a drink, right? We've been out here for 4 or 5 hours trail riding, have a drink. And he's just standing looking at the view, right? Looking way off into the mountains, enjoying the view and won't drink. And I think that some of that is because he doesn't know he needs to drink because his circulating sodium in his, blood has dropped to a point where he doesn't really have a thirst reflex because he lost all the sodium in sweat. And so that's part of the reason why you end up with them not wanting to drink.
Just a reminder, I'm never going to be on a trail ride standing in a river trying to get my horse to drink.
Jill is like
Nope.
Not into trail riding.
I'll look at the mountain from my feet. When I look at feed labels, I see all these electrolytes being guaranteed, at least on the major feed company bag. So why are electrolytes needed if the horse's feed already provides many of the nutrients that you see on electrolyte labels?
Mainly just because of the sheer amount of electrolyte your horse is losing in sweat, right? Feeds are just not going to provide the electrolyte levels necessary for electrolyte replenishment when the horse has been sweating heavily.
So how can listeners tell if an electrolyte is well balanced or not?
It's a great question because there's so many out there, right? And you do have to really, like everything else, look at the label, right? You need to look at the level of the various electrolytes. So if your horse is sweating heavily for an hour, right, and let's just say for easy math, he lost 10 liters of fluid in sweat, they will have lost about 28 grams of sodium, 53 grams of chloride, and about 14 grams of potassium. So you're looking for about twice as much chloride as sodium. The goal is a good electrolyte mirrors the composition of sweat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the concentration of electrolytes in that in that product needs to follow this similarly to the ratios that it would be in the horse's sweat, because the purpose of this electrolyte is to replace what was lost in sweat. In fact, if you and I could figure out how to scrape all this sweat off our horses all summer long and put that in a product and sell it, with the ideal electrolyte, right? Because you're just trying to put back in what they lost.
Right.
So you're looking for about twice as much chloride as sodium, and then the sodium to be about twice as high as the potassium. Right. So you've got to actually look at the numbers and do a little bit of, basic math. You also have to understand units, because instead of using grams, labels often use milligrams. If they're really annoying, they put everything in percentages, which is just not helpful. 1,000 milligrams is a gram. Okay. So you can do that. It's an easy conversion. So a good rule of thumb is that you need to be giving back about a third to a half of what's been lost in the sweat, right? So for the horse working in hot or humid conditions for an hour, that's lost 28 grams of sodium, 53 grams of chloride, and 14 grams of potassium. If you're going to give back half of that, you'd be giving back 14 grams of sodium, 26 grams of chloride, and 7 grams of potassium. So many electrolytes on the market just won't give you this level of replacement, right? Like the levels are just like 2,000 milligrams of sodium. Well, that's 2 grams, and we're looking to try and give them 14, right? It's just like you're going to give them half the container.
Right.
So looking for products so the other thing you can do is look for products that either have salt or chloride listed as the first ingredient. That's a good start. And if you're not getting about 6 grams of sodium and 12 grams of chloride per serving, it likely isn't going to be concentrated enough to be effective. Keep in mind, though, that there are more concentrated versions, but the more concentrated versions may still require multiple scoops to be given. I can think of some really good electrolytes out there that, are going to say on them, light sweating, give 30 grams, 1 scoop, moderate sweating, 1 to 2 scoops, heavy sweating, 2 to 3 scoops or whatever, right? Because it is just so much electrolyte we're trying to replace. So you really have to, I actually like to see that on it. I find that useful on the better quality products. They're going to give you incremental requirements based on how heavily the horse is sweating, rather than just give them 1 ounce.
You know what you don't want as your first ingredient?
What's that?
Sugar.
Yeah, that's true. You don't want sugar as a first ingredient.
We laugh about that, but there are electrolytes on the market that the first ingredient is sugar.
And, often, so sugar is in electrolytes is dextrose. Right. And, we can talk about this later, but like, just because an electrolyte has the word dex in the name doesn't mean it's all sugar. It's so bizarre, right? So you can have products that have no mention of sugar or dex in the name and have a lot of sugar in them. And then you can have some that have dex or some sugar-related name, and they don't have that much sugar in them. So I don't understand that. But anyway, yeah, read the labels.
Yeah. Lots of people wanted to know whether they need to be giving electrolytes if they're already giving salt.
Yes, if your horse is sweating, because the purpose of the salt was to provide the daily sodium chloride needs on a cool day, not working and not sweating, not to replace sweat losses. And the purpose of the electrolyte is to then additionally replace the sweat losses.
So we couldn't just give more salt.
You can, yeah, to a point you could. However, I think you get to a point where horses just won't eat that much. I mean, if you think about the amounts I was just talking about, you could be looking at 6 tablespoons of salt a day. Like, I think you get to a point where a lot of horses won't eat that. And and sodium chloride isn't going to give you those other electrolytes, right? It's not going to give you any potassium. It's not going to give you, we're talking about tiny amounts of calcium and magnesium, but that's not in there either. So, an electrolyte that's designed specifically for replacement of sweat would be a better option. But I personally, I can admit that I double my horse's salt intake in the summer, and he happily goes from eating 2 tablespoons a day to 4 tablespoons of salt. And if I need more than that, then I go to an electrolyte. But there's just like a limit to the amount of salt, they're going to consume.
So how should we be giving them? Because I know electrolytes come in powder. You can put them on the feed. You can put it in the water. And you can also buy electrolyte paste. Does it matter what form you use?
So my preference would be to add it to feed, but many people put them in water. It can be hard to get enough into them when you put it in water. A lot of horses don't really want to drink water. I mean, some do. It's just, and if you're putting them in water, you must always provide plain water as well. And there's research showing that actually when a hot horse is provided dilute saline to drink, so you make a bucket of saline solution, if they drink that, so this was done in like endurance horses, right? So the horses come in, they're hot, they're immediately given a bucket of saline. Those horses will drink more water in the hours after that than the horses that were just given straight water, right? So I think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? Because drinking salty water is going to make you thirsty. Right. So you can definitely train your horse to drink electrolytes in water. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely put them in water. My preference is to put them in feed. I typically find that horses, after they've eaten feed, will go and have a drink, or after they've eaten hay, they'll go and have a drink anyway. Pastes are useful when you're traveling, or if your horse has gone off feed. You do need to be a bit cautious, though, I think, when giving horses electrolytes. We don't know what their hydration status is, because a horse that's poorly hydrated when given electrolytes, you can actually make things worse and leave them more dehydrated, because if they don't drink, that electrolyte is going to sort of have an effect on fluid balance, in the gut and sort of surround, so it's, I'm always cautious. I'm always cautious of the paste, because you're just shoving it in there. The horse doesn't get a choice, right?
Right.
Whereas if you put it in a bucket of water, they could choose not to drink it. If you put it in feed, they could choose not to eat it. But I do think that, probably one tube of electrolytes is not going to make or break a situation, right? But I see this a lot with people that maybe they feel their horse is like slightly colicky, and they think it's maybe a mild, they haven't had enough to drink, right? So they'll go shove a tube of electrolyte paste into them to get them drinking. Okay, and many times that works, and that's great. But don't fall into the trap of like, well, I'll just give him another one because he hasn't drunk yet, And I would in that situation, I think you're better off seeking advice from your vet. Like if you know your horse hasn't been drinking and you're wanting to use electrolytes to get them drinking because you're worried about a colic situation, honestly, in a colic situation, I would call my vet before I'd really administer anything and just say, is it okay to give a tube of electrolyte? And many times they're probably going to say yes, right? Give a tube of electrolyte. But as I said, don't think 3 hours later when he hasn't drunk anything, oh, I'll just give him another one, right?
You mentioned earlier that it's a good rule of thumb to try and replace half the electrolytes that they've lost.
Yeah, mostly because a lot of horses just aren't going to consume that much more. And that's sort of, when I work with endurance horses that are out working for really, like horses doing Tevis this month, they're out there for hours, right? Sweating for really long periods of time. And so you do in those, again, that's when the pace come in handy, right? Those riders will actually carry a pace tube with them in their saddlebags and be able to administer those pastes as they're going along, which is handy. And again, you don't have long at the holds to get them eating and drinking and things, and you want them eating and drinking. So again, they'll use pace. A lot of endurance riders really like the pace for that reason. And it's just unreasonable to think that you're going to replace 100% of what they've lost in 24 hours in those horses. It's just such a lot of electrolyte that they've lost. So again, we try to, if we can get 50% would be great. 30% is good, right? So really the goal is to have a good electrolyte program going every day. And then when you have a day where you have a higher loss, it's not so critical. Horses do regulate the amount of electrolytes they lose in their urine. So if they do get a little bit depleted, they have that trick up their sleeve. They can actually conserve electrolytes, like their kidneys can conserve the electrolytes. But this is is something to think about if you live in a really hot area. If your horse is already struggling to stay on top of electrolyte demands, just living in the climate that you're in, what impact is exercise having on top of that, right? Which causes even more electrolyte loss. And you start to see why you can run into issues with dehydration and electrolyte imbalance over time in really hot climates where the horse is losing electrolyte just standing around in their climate, and then you work them on top of that. And you can see over time that you could really get yourself in a hole.
I think it's also worth noting that on our episode we did on anhydrosis with Dr. Brooks, that she mentioned that one of the causes of acute sudden onset anhydrosis can be electrolyte depletion. Yeah,
absolutely. Right. So if you're working your horse routinely in hot weather, you're going to be pushing their ability to regulate electrolyte intake, often, regardless of how good of a job you're doing to replenish them, right? And in some horses, this may result in them stopping sweating, which is what anhydrosis is. And I've definitely seen that. I saw that in a horse in a barn I was in a few years back. And in that situation, the owner was giving salt and the horse stopped sweating. But then what we noticed was that the barn was feeding his pelleted balancer dry with the salt. And she had actually increased the salt because of the hot weather. And the salt had just fallen through the pellets at the bottom of the bucket. And the horse was eating the pellets. And when we went and looked in his bucket, it was full of salt. The bottom, and in that situation, the folks at the barn's staff had been feeding. It was a bucket that was like bolted to the wall, right? So you couldn't take it down.
Right.
And they just reached over the gate. It was like behind a plank of wood, so you couldn't really see it.
Rushed it out?
No, they didn't do that. They just dumped an everyday's feed on top of what was, so when we looked in the bucket, there was probably like a week's worth of salt in there. So she was giving salt. It didn't mean the horse was consuming the salt, right? So the horse stopped sweating. We got salt back into him and, he started to start sweating again and subsequently has sweat every summer since just fine, right? So he's a classic case of acute onset linked to inadequate electrolyte intake.
When should we be giving electrolytes? Like you hear people preloading electrolytes before events and shipping. Like, is that recommended and does that actually work?
So they can't store more electrolytes than they need, right? So that's part of why they get peed out in urine, because the horse can't store them, and so then they just pee out excess amounts. So on the one hand, preloading can be a waste of money, but it's not really, as long as your horse has well-functioning kidneys and access to plenty of clean, fresh water, consuming too much electrolytes, they're going to pee it out. It's a waste of money. It's probably not overly, a detriment to your horse. I guess you could see it somewhat as an insurance policy to sort of load them up beforehand, but my preference would be that folks just have a good daily routine around salt and electrolytes rather than doing nothing. And then at critical moments, like, oh, I'm going to a show next week, they suddenly just like dump a ton of electrolytes in their horse, right? Like that's not ideal.
So can you give too much salt or electrolytes?
Technically, yeah. I mean, you could, but I mean, I think it's. I've never heard of that being an issue. And I mean, there's always an issue. I mean, I've had the client whose horse just inhales salt blocks for whatever reason, right? And so he didn't get a salt block. He got, lots of loose salt in his feed and electrolytes when needed. But as long as the horse is drinking adequately, has access to fresh, clean water, they're going to consume that and then flush out any excess electrolytes in their urine.
And are there times when we should not be giving horses electrolytes?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think if I don't know the hydration status of a horse, I'm always a little cautious, right? So if I know the horse is dehydrated, I'm going to be cautious about that. And I think giving a small amount to see if you can tempt them to drink is probably fine. Again, I would just, if your horse isn't drinking, reaching out to your vet for guidance on, whether they would advise administering electrolytes in that moment is probably smart.
There are a lot of products on the market now that say they have electrolytes in them and that they help with hydration. Some of the products are hydration boosters. They're flavors that get added to the water. And then there's treats that have electrolytes in them. What are your thoughts on these products?
As far as the electrolyte treats, I've yet to see any that make a meaningful contribution to your horse's daily electrolyte needs. To me, they're like all the fancy salts we talked about earlier, right? Like they often have such tiny amounts of electrolyte in them that they're not going to make any meaningful contribution. I mean, clearly any little bit helps, but I don't want listeners to think, oh, I can feed these electrolyte treats and replace all the sweat my horse lost from just doing an hour of hard work in a hot climate. Like I've not seen one yet. I wait to be corrected that one exists. As for the flavors, I think they can be very useful for enticing picky drinkers to drink. So it's definitely worth trying if you want your horse to drink more water. Good to have on hand for traveling, to places where water maybe tastes different and your horse doesn't want to drink the strange water. It's fun enrichment, right? I know you've played around with it with your horses. They seem to have fun with it from what you shared with me. I think if you're using herbal products, be careful if you're competing that whatever, herbs have been put in there are legal for competition use.
What about the post-work mashes that are on the market? A number of them claim to help with hydration and electrolyte replenishment. Do those actually work?
Anything fed as a mash is going to help get water in your horse, right? So that's awesome. I mean, anytime we can get water in a horse, that's great. But I'm a bit of a cynic about these commercial mash products. I mean, I can make a mash out of my balancer or some hay pellets. So I don't really know why I need to go and buy something that has the word mash on it. And again, why would you introduce, they sort of say, oh, you can feed this after work. I mean, some of them say you can feed it after work instead of, say, doing a bran mash, and that it's, from a nutrient standpoint, similar to the feed that you would otherwise be feeding. And it's like, well, yes, from a mineral type standpoint, that might be true, but the major ingredients are, can be quite different than what you're normally feeding. So why would you introduce a feed randomly after work when we know that we shouldn't be making sudden feed changes because that's bad for digestive health? So to me, it's no better than feeding a bran mash once a week if that's how you're using these mashes. As for giving you the electrolytes you need, as I said again before with the treats, I mean, every little bit helps. But again, I've yet to find any of these mashes that are going to replace the need for a properly balanced electrolyte supplement. And that's my concern, is that people see the word electrolyte on these bags, on these labels, and then they think they're taken care of and that they don't need the well-formulated electrolyte supplement. I just don't think that's true.
All this info is great, but I know that I am not the only one who owns a horse that will not eat salt. So this is a whole new thing for me too, but what can owners do if their horses will not eat salt?
Yeah, I think I've been hearing from Jill at least weekly about her frustrations over this. So it's not uncommon. I will say it's not the majority of my clients' horses just eat salt just fine, but you're not uncommon in that there are definitely horses out there that don't like eating salt. So there are a few tricks you can try. If you're giving oil already, like let's say you're using a flax oil or a fish oil for your omega-3s, or even just a little bit of a vegetable oil like canola oil, if you put the salt in the feed and pour the oil on top of the salt before you mix the salt in, and the salt is coated in oil, that can mask the taste of the salt. And so for some horses, they then don't realize it's in the feed and they'll eat it. Similarly, if you have a horse that it's okay to use some molasses, you could try the same trick with molasses. Honestly, the biggest thing is oftentimes people are putting their salt in dry feed in a pellet, like I talked about before, and it's just falling to the bottom of the bucket. So sometimes just something as simple as getting the feed, making it damp, can help.
So I had a pony for the last 8 years who would pretty much eat anything you put in front of him. And now I have one that won't eat anything. And, I'm a faithful salt feeder, and I quickly realized, this is really hard when you have a horse that doesn't want it. So first he started flipping his feed pan and then just picking out the pellets and then leaving all the salt on the ground.
It's amazing how you can do that.
I know. I tried wetting the feed and he refused to eat any of it. I tried drizzling a bit of molasses on it so that the salt would stick to it because I was like, oh, molasses is delicious. Who doesn't like that? Wouldn't eat it, refused to eat any of it. So I've ordered the pelleted salt and electrolytes, and he sort of eats them. He does flip his feed pan and pick through the pellets and tends to leave some of them, but he is eating the majority, I would say.
That's good.
Of the pelleted. So we'll see how long. I'm only, 7 days roughly into feeding the pellets. Mm-hmm. So we'll see if this continues. But for the picky pony eaters out there, try the pelleted. Or one of the other things that Claire has said. I didn't try the oil, but maybe that's something I should be trying too.
Yeah. You could get yourself a tire to put your pan in. Those rubber pans fit inside of a tire. And then they can't flip them.
I'm not doing that.
Just saying. So some horses that won't eat salt, right? Finding a flavored electrolyte that they might like, maybe your only option. Or using some of the herbal flavors that you can put in water, you can put in feed. That might work, in some cases too. But if you go to just, your horse won't eat salt, but they'll eat the orange flavored electrolytes, say, then you need to keep in mind that your first serving of electrolyte is actually your salt replacement. And then you're going to need additional servings of electrolyte to make up for sweat loss. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. I just want to add, my horse won't eat the electrolytes either. So yeah, I'm doing both. He doesn't want any of it. I haven't tried the orange flavor, but I guess that could do it. But I do also have a bunch of loose herbs here from making water buffets. So I could see if maybe something like that.
There's something he likes. Yeah, try that.
Maybe he's fancy.
Yeah, he's bougie. That would fit.
He came to the right place. So online, I've seen people caution about giving salt because it can cause gastric ulcers. Is this actually true?
I feel like this is the whole, this is like one of those things that just won't disappear.
Like the 52 thoroughbreds?
Like the 52 thoroughbreds, yeah. Or the fact that high protein causes joint defects or whatever. Yeah, it's just like, alfalfa makes horses hot, right? So it's all one of those things that just makes me sigh. Okay, so it came from research. Okay, there was research. And it's based on this work that was done in 2005, so 21 years ago. And it looked at administering hypertonic electrolyte solutions every hour for 8 hours, right? So they did this to 14 horses that were divided randomly into equal groups, and they gave them either 60 mLs of water, right? That was their control placebo, or just over 56 grams of commercial electrolyte supplement mixed in the same amount of water, and they dosed that with an oral syringe every hour for 8 hours. And the minimum concentration of the electrolytes in that was basically 28 grams of dry commercial product was providing 5.5 grams of sodium, just under 12 grams of chloride, about 3.5 grams of potassium. And they scored the gastric lesions, prior to starting. And then they looked at them after the treatments as well, right? And so then they analyzed the difference. So this, as I said, these were hypertonic electrolytes, meaning the concentration of the electrolytes was greater than what would have been in the horse's plasma. So this was a good, those values I just gave you, those meet what we were talking about earlier, right? This was a good, well-concentrated electrolyte. But they were giving that amount every hour for 8 hours, right? And what they found was they found a significant increase in the average number of ulcers and also severity. The severity was really high, right? In mostly non-glandular squamous ulcers in the stomach, right? And so the mean like number of ulcers was a 3.6, so the average number was 3.6, and the average severity was a 2.7 after giving this electrolyte solution. And so everybody got very excited about the fact that, oh my gosh, if you give electrolytes and salt, you're going to give your horse ulcers. But the framing of this study is important because the dosing schedule was designed to simulate very aggressive electrolyte pace protocols that I was talking about earlier that you might do with an endurance horse, right? Not your typical daily feeding of salt. Like nobody's going out and administering 2 tablespoons of salt to their horse every hour for 8 hours a day. Right? It's just, it's not, it's not a real world.
Nor would you want to, not even about going out 8 times a day, but if it's 2 tablespoons a day, why would you do that once an hour?
Right, exactly. So they were doing a very specific thing, right? They were simulating, and I would say a lot of endurance people aren't even giving that much electrolyte that frequently. They're not giving it every hour, right? So it was an unrealistic, but the takeaway was electrolyte supplementation causes ulcers, and we can't get away from that, right? It's important. You have to understand the context of research sometimes, right? Again, it's like one of the golden rules of research is you should not extrapolate your data into, other populations and things. So it doesn't flow well into the real world. Now, there was another study done more recently. So this study was done in 2023. And they supplemented 15 warm blood horses with sodium chloride pellets. So you'll find this interesting now that you're trying salt pellets. And the dose was to replace what would have been lost in about 10 liters of sweat, right? So this was done every day, not every hour, every day for 19 days, right? So what I really liked about this was they looked at the ulcers prior to and at the end of this 19-day study. And the initial prevalence of gastric mucosal lesions, so, stomach ulcers, was 85%. So 85% of those horses had ulcers before the study started. And they found that the sodium chloride salt pellets did not adversely affect the gastric mucosa, right? Their conclusion was that daily salt pellet supplementation, they found it to be palatable, and they found it to be a safe way to replace, electrolyte losses from sweating and exercising horses. And what I really like about this study is that so many of the horses had ulcers at the start, so they could really see whether, not only did it cause ulcers, but did it actually make the ulcers they already had worse? And it didn't. So unless you're planning to go crazy with your electrolyte and salt supplementation, I'm really not concerned about gastric ulcers.
How about don't go crazy? Very
long-winded answer to your questions.
Yeah. Don't give salt or electrolytes every hour for 8 hours every day. That's not the way it's supposed to be dosed.
Right.
Okay, one last question about sugar in commercial electrolytes. Like, why is there sugar in so many products, and what is its purpose?
It tastes nice, right? So
my horse doesn't think so.
Okay, well, fair enough. You just have a problem, child. But it's actually a really interesting question. So we have to kind of look at the human sports nutrition research, I think, to kind of get a sense of why. And it's, that research has consistently found that sport drinks and oral rehydration solutions, as they're known, containing sodium and carbohydrate, which sugar is a carbohydrate, right, are more effective for rehydration than plain water alone. So in one study, participants retained about 75% of their lost fluid. So they exercise, you lose a bunch of fluid in sweat. You weigh the person before, you weigh them after, you can tell how much they've lost, right? And how much of that were they able to replace through these, sports drinks or whatever. And this one study found that they, retained about 75% of their lost fluid after drinking this sports drink, compared with only 58%, retaining their fluid when they drank plain water. So that's a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
However, this is one of those times where carrying research, again, it's always dangerous. Extrapolating research outside of your sample population can be tricky because this human data doesn't always transfer to horses. So there was a research study done in horses way back in 1999, and they found different results. So in that study, they took an isotonic electrolyte solution with a composition similar to equine sweat, And they compared it to an isotonic glycerin electrolyte concentration for oral rehydration therapy in exercising horses.
Isotonic meaning that the solution they were giving had the same electrolyte concentration as would be in the horse's plasma?
Yes, iso meaning the same, and tonic being that's to do with electricity, but yes, exactly, right? So they had these 10 horses that they dehydrated using Lasix, right? So that causes dehydration. And then they allocated them randomly to receive these 4 different solutions. So they either got the isotonic sweat-like electrolyte solution, they took the same solution and diluted it to half the strength, so it became hypotonic, less than, right, plasma, and gave them that. Or they gave them the isotonic electrolyte solution with added glucose, or they gave them plain water. And when I say gave it, they administered it through nasogastric tube, right? They weren't messing around. This wasn't like, how much do you want to drink? It's like, you're getting this much. Right. We're going to like put it down a nasogastric tube. And then they took blood samples before and throughout 6 hours of rehydration. So they put it down in their stomachs, and then how much are they going to drink afterwards, right? And what they found was that all the solutions recovered all the horses like recovered to pre-Lasix values when it came to some things we look at, like what's called packed cell volume. That's something on a red blood cell panel, and total plasma protein. These are values that you look at to kind of hint at dehydration that you'll see on a red blood cell panel. And they found that they all went back to where they had been before they were dehydrated. They found there were no changes in sodium value during the rehydration period when the isotonic sweat-like solution was used. And so you might think, well, then it didn't work. And so, yeah, in some ways, in those 6 hours, they did not replenish their sodium levels. However, what was interesting is what happened in the other 3 groups. So the isotonic electrolyte, they didn't get back to where they had been before, but the other 3 solutions, they actually developed something called what's called significant hyponatremia, and especially when the hypotonic, like dilute electrolyte solution and water were used.
And what does hyponatremia mean? It
means that the sodium levels in the blood were abnormally low, right? So they actually got lower. Right, so since sodium's a main mineral controlling how water is balanced, I mentioned earlier, it helps balance fluid across cells, right, inside and outside of blood vessels and cells. Low blood sodium usually reflects a problem in fluid balance. So these horses that were given the dilute electrolyte and were basically had lower sodium levels. And often too much water. It means that they have too much water relative to the amount of sodium present, right? Not that they're necessarily losing sodium themselves. It's just like they've consumed a ton of water and now everything's super low concentration, if that makes sense. So when the horses were given the plain water and the watered down electrolyte solution or the glucose electrolyte solution, their blood sodium became lower, the concentration lowered below normal during the rehydration period. So only the sweat matching full strength electrolyte solution kept blood sodium steady because it replaced the water and the sodium in the same proportion the horse had actually lost through sweating. So yeah, it's kind of interesting research.
Does that mean that we should be avoiding electrolytes with sugar in them?
I mean, I think some sugar in electrolyte is fine because, as I mentioned earlier, its other purpose is to make the product more palatable. However, it should not be the first ingredient because then there just likely isn't enough electrolyte in there to be effective. And you may actually be setting yourself up for a situation you don't want.
I see a lot of people suggest giving their horses sports drinks for hydration. This doesn't sound like a great idea. What are your thoughts on giving your horse a Gatorade?
It's not going to be effective in a horse, right? It's like, so the amount of electrolyte in a Gatorade is so tiny compared to the amount that's being lost in horse sweat, it's not going to be effective, right? And again, it's set up for human rehydration, which has been shown to be helped by having glucose in it, right, sugar in it. And we have research showing that this is not helpful in horses. So it's just not going to be effective. Our physiology just isn't the same. Right? If you want to put some in your water as a flavor, we've talked about that in other episodes to help get picky drinkers to drink strange water. That's one thing. But it's not an effective way to correct electrolyte balance after sweating.
Well, we answered so many questions. That was a lot. That was probably way more than anybody ever wanted to know about salt or electrolytes.
Yeah, probably.
But hopefully everyone's a little bit clearer now on why salt is such an important part of our horse's diet and when and why to add the electrolytes. Is there anything else you would like to add to this? I
do have one last fun fact.
Okay, I love that.
I have to say, it was a fun episode to put together. I mean, it made me go look at all the different bougie salts out there, which
it's mind-blowing.
I learned something, so it's been fun. But here's a fun fact. So researchers at a university in Turkey looked at the effect of different colored buckets on water intake. And so they painted buckets. They had galvanized buckets, right? So the buckets were the same. They just painted them different colors. And they put them up the same distance from each other along a fence in an outdoor paddock. And they had 6 horses. They were all on the same diet, and they observed them over 18 days. And the bucket positions rotated, so it couldn't be attributed to, well, they just liked the one with the better view than the one that was, in the corner or whatever, right? They changed the locations. And the horses showed a clear, statistically significant preference for turquoise buckets. They actually consumed about 6.5 liters of water from a turquoise bucket. Compared to a red bucket, they only consumed about 2.8 liters on average. That's a pretty big difference.
That's a huge difference.
And so overall, the overall pattern was that horses strongly favored lighter toned blue-green colors over darker tones. So turquoise is best, followed by light blue, light green, green, yellow, red. And I think that's amusing that green, yellow, red makes me think of a traffic light. Red for no, right? But it kind of lines up when you think about how horses' eyes work. It sort of makes sense, right? So horses have what's called dichromatic vision, which is similar to a person with red-green color blindness. Like they see blues and yellows well, but have difficulty distinguishing reds and greens. So it's not surprising that colors in the sort of blue spectrum stood out and were preferred over reds and like the darker, duller tones. It's possible that they just can't distinguish the red bucket from the surroundings quite as well. Anyway, it's one of those things I don't know that it makes it, potentially a massive difference, but it's, if you've got a picky drinker, you might want to see if changing the color of the bucket has an effect.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.